So thank you so much for inviting us. It's great to be here, and we're delighted. And what else would an English professor and a doctor work on together but opera?
It's a natural.
It's a natural, obviously. We've always loved opera, and we've just finished publishing our 4th book together on opera, and it's just something that we just love. And we can talk about that later. But tonight, we're going to take you on a journey. It's a journey across time and across space. We're all going to go to the opera together. In fact, we're going to go on an opera tour. We're going to start in the 16th century. We're going to leap wildly over hundreds of years and across continents and oceans, because we have tickets for some of the most famous opera performances in history. Needless to say, it won't be a comprehensive tour, but we do feel the need to warn you. You're going to have to be a little, shall we say, more flexible than you might be normally. Flexible in terms of class, gender identity, and even tolerance, because our eyes and ears as audience members are about to be struck by sights and sounds not necessarily experienced in 2015. We're going to have a pre-tour meeting though, so we're right here in Toronto, and not just because we're all here already, but because it's a city with very rich operatic resources that actually prepare us really well for our tour. We have, as you know, the Canadian Opera Company with its 6 productions a year. We have Opera Atelier, and I'll be speaking more about that later, a Baroque opera and dance troupe. They do 2 productions annually. There's Opera in Concert, Voice Box, which puts on 4 little-known operas, usually with piano accompaniment. And then there's the Opera School at the U of T. It does 2 full-length productions with full orchestral accompaniment. If you've never been, they're the best deal in town. They're absolutely wonderful. But that's not all. We have, I think, over 10, we counted, independent, smaller opera companies like Against the Grain, and Joel's been here, and Topher, Tapestry Opera. And what these groups do is what's called chamber opera. So it's opera for smaller forces in smaller theaters. It's less expensive, obviously. Our favorite one right now is something called the Bicycle Opera Project. I don't know if you know about this, but it's the only pedal-powered company of opera in the world. They literally travel around Southern Ontario last year, and they're out on the East Coast this year, pedaling and with all their costumes and their instruments and everything. They're wonderful. And I mentioned all the other small independent opera companies like Fawn and Metro Youth Opera and many others. So it's a very culturally rich operatic city, even if we don't add in, and we probably should, the many cinemas in the city that broadcast live the Metropolitan Opera's HD transmissions, right? So in other words, without even leaving Toronto, we could see upwards of 25 operas a year. And these would range from early Renaissance operas like Monteverdi's Orfeo, which was written in 1607, performed by Opera Atelier, to contemporary works like Kaya Sarajevo's 2001 opera called Love from Afar that the COC did a while back. And of course, everything in between those dates as well. But we're an adventurous opera group, okay, tonight. So we're going to head out to Florence, Italy, in the 16th century. We did warn you, you have to be flexible, so hang in.
Now, the 16th century has been very good to Florence's ruling family, the Medicis. The wealth and the power that they have amassed through banking the century before have been expanded by the election of 3 popes from the family. And the first, Pope Leo X, famously remarked, "God has seen fit to give us the papacy, now let's enjoy it." It's 1589, and we, the noble friends of the Medicis, certainly don't want to be their enemies, we've been invited to the wedding of the French princess Christine of Lorraine to Grand Duke Ferdinando de' Medici. And because it's a grand affair, we're actually going to have to stop in Florence for a whole month. But as Botticelli here will famously paint us, we're going to be entertained by banquets, a tournament, a mock naval battle, and lavish performances at the Uffizi Palace. And it's the latter that we, on our tour, have actually come to see and to hear. One very long play, many, many hours, is to be enlivened by what are called intermedi between the acts. The painted sets and these fabulous tableaus, one even involving a fire-breathing dragon, are to be a backdrop to stories told in music and song. We're getting closer. And here we're introduced to Count Giovanni di Bari, He's the author of the text of these intermedi, but more importantly, he is the midwife of the form that will become opera just a decade later. So Count de Bardi is an aristocratic Florentine polymath, and he's gathered around him for intellectual discussion a group of philosophers, poets, historians, but also musicians and other artists who collectively have come to be known as the Camerata Fiorentina. And this being the Renaissance, the Camerata are drawn to the art of ancient Greece and Rome and are particularly taken by what they know of the impact on audience members of Greek tragic theater, especially the plays formed at the festivals of Dionysus. And from evidence like this, as our work, where you can see someone playing music, from evidence like this, they believe that the impact of these plays must be the result of the use of music rather than just the drama itself. And they've actually some reason to believe that the words of the text have been sung or chanted. Now the texts were preserved and were known in the Renaissance, but the music, of course, wasn't. So this was pure and is pure speculation on their part. But speculate they do, and they imagine a recreation of Greek drama in words and in music. But there's a problem. The music of their period is polyphonic. In other words, it's music in which several musical lines are superimposed, making the understanding of the words rather difficult. And this is what it sounds like. But obviously, it would be hard to make comprehensible drama in words and music out of this kind of sound. So they envisioned a new kind of music called monody. And here, a single vocal line is accompanied by the most minimum supportive instrumentation, and opera is born. And again, the Medicis have invited us as their friends, 11 years later, to yet another lavish wedding, this time of Marie de Medici to Henry IV of France. The year is 1600, and we're just going to slip on our best doublet and hose or our best gown, and this time head to the Pitti Palace, where we're going to be treated to a performance of Eurydice, the first of many operas to follow on the Orpheus theme. And the story's popularity is always interesting, but it's likely in part because of realism. If you've just invented a new form of sung drama, what better hero than Orpheus, the singing poet who demonstrates the power of music by charming the creatures of the underworld? And here's what the first extant opera actually sounds like.
Clearly, you can hear the difference in those two pieces of music, right? It's much easier to hear and follow the words with this much simpler monodic line. Now, for cheering opera, it's going to be very relevant in a minute. We'll see. It's Carnival. You'll see
Yeah,
why.
there we go.
Now, while other northern Italian courts soon followed suit following the Florentine example, they created similar entertainments. Something quite different is happening in Venice. And Venice is the next stop on our opera tour. Now, as good European tourists of our day, we've been here before. Venice is the place to go for carnival. That's why it's so loud. However, in 1637, when we arrived, we discovered that there's a new entertainment in town. In addition to the usual spoken theater and the commedia dell'arte performances that we've gone to in the past, we can go to see something called l'andromeda, said to be rappresentata in musica, represented in music. And it's put on in a public theater, not in a court, and that means we have to pay. We're well-off tourists, though, so it's okay. We can afford it. So we're going to join the leisure classes and the professionals of the Venetian Republic. So this is a republic, that's why they don't have a court. But we're going to experience a court-like spectacle as part of a paying audience. This is the first time we've been a paying audience. By the time we return to Venice in the 1650s, we find that many new theaters have been built, and over 50 new operas, this new genre, have been produced by impresarios. Now, these impresarios are people who would rent theaters that were built by aristocratic families. Now, these families are themselves motivated by a funny mixture of patriotism, self-indulgence, and, because this is Venice, the hope of profit. And as the Venetian Carnival audience, what do we demand? Noise, yes. We demand vocal virtuosity, and we demand spectacle. We can't help noticing, though, that this art form now bears only a distant resemblance to what we had experienced in Florence only 50 years ago. And there's several major differences. First of all, the sung drama now has two kinds of music, not just the one that you heard a moment ago. There's something called recitative, in which the plot is advanced. It's sort of conversation. Conversation occurs among the characters in recitative. And then there are these things called arias, in which characters stop and reflect and emote. Think of them as the equivalent of the Shakespearean soliloquy. The second thing is, we now particularly prize high-pitched voices for vocal virtuosity. This means that the highest paid persons of all of those involved in producing these entertainments for us are not the composers, not the librettists, but sopranos and castrati. Over to the doctor for something about castrati.
So a word about castrati. Castrati are male singers who have been castrated before puberty, thereby maintaining the pitch of their voice as that of a voice soprano or an alto. But it's housed in a body that grows normally and that is otherwise adult. This practice isn't, of course, legal anywhere, but it is strange how many young Italian male singers have had what they describe as unfortunate accidents. When we visit Venice, castrati are important members of church choirs. This is where they started, where women were not permitted to sing within the churches. But they've also become the stars, almost the rock star equivalents of the opera stage. And what does a castrato voice sound like? Well, one of our fellow audience members at this time described it as the combination of unearthly beauty of tone, the flexibility of a coloratura soprano, unnatural breath control, and an enormous volume.
Thank you, Doctor. Mind you, here in Venice, we can't always hear the singer at all, or even the way we might like to. The public in the theater is astoundingly rowdy and rude. It is carnival time, of course, and the operas, too, seem to have taken on the spirit of carnival in a funny way. They celebrate its excess and pageantry and bad behavior. They also mix comedy and burlesque with historical themes, and it's just weird by any European standard at this time. But we're here today to see a remount of Claudio Monteverdi's The Coronation of Poppaea. Now, his librettist for this opera is a member of a free-thinking society described as a group of skeptical libertines extolling a peculiarly Venetian brand of immorality. So here's the story. We have Poppaea, who has very deviously schemed her way into the position of being Roman empress, and Nero, yes, Nero, the guy, that's that Nero, smitten with her to the extent that he has not only exiled his wife, yes, he had a wife, but he has also commanded his disapproving tutor and mentor, Seneca, to commit suicide and get out of the way. One of the audience members who saw it just before us described the opera story as most unedifying and in places virtually obscene. But the final love duet to absolutely beautiful music that you're about to hear, odd music for our 21st century ears, is actually a celebration of vice triumphant and virtue mocked. Think about that as you listen to this music. Though what we just heard featured two women singing, one was en travesti, so what's become known as a trouser role. In Venice, we would have heard a castrato and a woman. But you know, it doesn't matter. Gender specificity, believe it or not, is not required in Venetian theater. Cross-dressing is totally in. Castrati and women play both male and female roles. But don't worry, we're not going to expect quite that amount of flexibility from our tour group tonight.
So Italy is obviously the birthplace, and it's the cultural center of opera up to this point. But these Venetian troupes began to travel, not only throughout Italy, but also to Paris and to the German-speaking lands, and opera begins to spread throughout Europe. But by the end of the 17th century, the excess and vulgarity of Venetian opera provoke a reaction everywhere, both in the court and in the public theaters. In Rome, there's a movement to purify the arts, starting with poetry, but this also includes opera. And here the lofty aesthetic ideals include exterminating bad taste and seeing to it that it shall not arise again. The comic aspects of these opera plots disappear, and they're replaced by what is being called unremitting moralizing and seriousness of purpose. And the result is, not surprisingly, called opera seria, serious opera. And we're now going to move on our tour to London, England in 1711, where the opera seria master, Georg Friedrich Händel, has been sent ahead of his employer, who is about to become England's new monarch, George I. German by birth, Händel, as he is now known, has trained in both Florence and Rome. And with an operatic success in Venice just behind him, Händel then changes the musical life in England for the next 30 years, with the production of his opera, Rinaldo, at the King's Theatre in the Haymarket. Now, it's not that he won't face challenges in these same years. Producing opera in London was never simple. But it becomes much more complex when a second opera company called the Opera of the Nobility was formed in 1733. And this upstart company boasts the famous castrato Farinelli, who will later be called, and I cite, very likely the greatest opera singer who ever lived. So we'd like you to see and to hear a 20th century attempt to capture both the presence and the voice of Farinelli. Now, in order to try to reproduce the quality of what a castrato voice might have sounded like, this modern film used a high countertenor voice blended with a soprano extension upwards. Unfortunately, or rather fortunately, we don't have any castrati today, so we have to kind of simulate it. So let's listen and watch to a little bit of Farinelli.
Oh
But on our tour, we're actually going to attend an earlier performance of an opera called Astianate. And this stars the two reigning female singers of Handel's company, which was called the Royal Academy of Music. And here they are. The theater that night is even noisier than ever because of their rather vicious rivalry. So beyond the usual coming and going of audience members, the eating and the playing cards, making this theater feel more like a nightclub than a temple of art, the cheering and the booing of the rival factions supporting these two singers amounts to such a frenzy, and the vocal pyrotechnics of these two women reach such a height that in the middle of the opera, it explodes into a physical altercation on stage between the two women, ending the performance, closing down the theater, closing down the season. But things got even worse. So after 1733, the opera of the nobility and Handel's company go head to head. They're in complete competition, and they perform on the same days of the week, and both of them go broke. Which brings us to that old adage, people will later say that the history of opera tells the story of who picks up the deficit. It's true today. Opera's always been an expensive art form, requires not only composers and librettists, but conductors, directors, singers, musicians, designers, people to create what's designed, stagehands, and so on.
So sailing back across the channel, we're moving from London to Paris on our tour. But as we do, we're going to have to back up a little bit in time. We're going to the court of Louis XIV. When the young Sun King, as he was known, ascends to the throne in 1669, he invites to his court a young Florentine composer, Giovanni Battista Lulli, who quickly becomes Jean-Baptiste Lully, adapting not only his name, but his Italian operatic training to suit French royal tastes. Now, Lully creates a brand new form of very lavish, it is the court of Louis XIV, lavish theater called tragédie lyrique, so lyric tragedy. It's linked to French spoken tragedy and to dance with the addition of really magical, enormously spectacular stage effects. So opera, with its classical origins and its exploitation of spectacle, provides the perfect vehicle for conveying a sense of the mythic importance and the grandeur of the French monarch. Now, there are no castrati in France. I mean, there probably are, but they don't sing in France. Can't sing in France. There is ballet, though, and dance now becomes a staple of French opera. Now, I'm going to fast forward for a moment. This is what Toronto's Opera Atelier began as, a French Baroque dance and opera company. And their production of Lully's opera Percée was performed at Versailles last summer in the very same theater in which it was first performed in 1682, which I think was a very magical moment for them. We, of course, got to see it in Toronto the year before, but that was even easier. Here's, to just give you a little flavor of a bit of a sense of what they do. This is their version of a mix of French opera and dance.
explore just why and how Paris becomes opera central in the 19th century, we have to take another little side trip to meet a major 18th century figure we haven't mentioned yet. But he's one who summed up in his time everything and did so brilliantly. And this, of course, is Wolfgang Amadeus Mozart. He worked in every musical theatrical form of his age. He composed 5 opera serie, including one that you may have seen at the Canadian Opera Company recently, called La Clemenza di Tito, which was composed in 1791. It was based on a libretto by the most famous writer of librettos ever. His name was Pietro Metastasio. Mozart also wrote 7 comic operas, or opera buffe, in Italian, including the justly famous ones in collaboration with the brilliant, cynical Lorenzo da Ponte. Those are The Marriage of Figaro, Don Giovanni, and Così fan tutte. Another opera that we saw recently at the CLS Theatre. Mozart also wrote 5 operas in German, in the style of Singspiel, a mix of spoken and sung drama. His Zauberflöte, or Magic Flute, is seen as a starting point for this whole tradition of German opera. But we should note that Mozart never expected that we would be watching Don Giovanni or the Magic Flute in 2015. Operas in his time were written for particular theater, particular singers, particular audiences. In other words, operas were transient, they were ephemeral. There was no standard repertory to be replayed year after year. That only came much later in the 19th century. So, back to 19th century Paris, right after the French Revolution.
Surprisingly, despite opera's association with the court and with nobility, it doesn't decline during or after the Revolution. Rather, it comes to be seen as the cultural glory of France and the key to the economic health of Paris. So in the 1820s and after, when our tour group arrives in Paris, we actually have 3 opera houses to choose from. They're all subsidized and they're all regulated by the French state. First, there's the Opéra Comique. So it is allowed to do, and I stress the allowed, to do musical drama with spoken dialogue. Then there's the Opéra itself, whose operatic productions are licensed to use recitative, but not spoken dialogue, and all the performances have to be in French. The French invented the word bureaucracy, remember? Our third choice is the Théâtre des Italiens, which has the right to put on all operas in Italian. Now, opera seria has faded by this point, it's much less fashionable, so it's here that we're going to get a chance to see our first productions of operas by those Italian masters of what comes to be called bel canto, literally beautiful song. Rossini, Donizetti, Bellini. With bel canto, the Italian emphasis is on melody and on the voice, the voce. Rossini, when asked what the 3 most important elements of Italian opera are, famously answers voce, voce, voce. Voice, voice, voice. And indeed, this is where the tenor comes into his own and becomes the next star of the operatic stage. Now, up to this point, tenors have always used what's called head voice or falsetto to get to the top notes. One day, the tenor singing Rossini's William Tell gets a little carried away in performance and uses his full chest voice to do the high notes. Rossini is aghast. He calls this, and I cite, the squawk of a capon with its throat cut. But a new style is born. Real men sing in this way, and gender difference finally arrives in opera. Here's a 21st century example of that new style. We're going to play a little bit of Juan Diego Flores singing bel canto. It's from Bellini's La Sonnambula from the Metropolitan Opera.
Perché non posso odiarti, infedel com'io vorrei, ma del tutto ancor non sei cancellata, cancellata dal mio cuore. Possa un altro amor traditrice non temer dal mio dolor altro voto a non temer dal mio dolor altro voto a non temer dal mio dolor.
Now, every 19th century composer in Western Europe wants to write for the big house in Paris. It's the most highly subsidized house with the most resources, and that's the Opéra. On our first of several trips to Paris this century, we go to the Opéra housed in the Salle Le Pelletier. This very advanced theater is the first to use gas for lighting, then limelight, and ultimately electricity. Its stage machinery is also revolutionary, and opera creators are encouraged to exploit its facilities with the assistance of a metteur en scène, the first time what today we would call a director becomes part of the production of opera. The orchestra's superior playing and the higher fees paid to both composers and artists combine to make this a very attractive opera house. Because of all these technical and financial resources, operas produced here can be longer, louder, more lavish, and more adventurous in style. And thus is born French grand opera. 5-act spectacles of historical interest with grand passions playing the personal off against the historical. And in these, the large chorus becomes a character in a sense with whom we in the audience are meant to identify. In our shape-shifting tour across time and space, we, the audience members, have now morphed into the haute bourgeoisie, an aristocracy of wealth rather than birth. And French novelists like Gustave Flaubert send their bourgeois heroines like Madame Bovary to the opera for both emotional and erotic thrills. This is a shot from a later film version of the novel Madame Bovary. The theater has continued to have a primarily social function. It's a place to see and to be seen. And this will become even more obvious in 1875, when the Palais Garnier, commissioned by Napoleon III, finally opens. And this This is a view of part of its vast public spaces. This is a grand staircase going up. To go to the opera is to be seen in these glittering halls. And his city planner, the infamous Baron Haussmann, will carve out of the old city of Paris a grand avenue to link the opera house to the royal palace at one end, and at the others to the stock exchange, the Printemps department store, and 2 railway stations, a sure sign of the upper bourgeois environment in which opera will come to thrive.
And not surprisingly, it is to the Opéra that Italy's most famous 19th century opera composer, Giuseppe Verdi, comes to try his hand at grand opera. He's lured by the technical, the musical, and the financial resources of this theater. His work has already been produced at the Théâtre des Italiens, of course, but it's the Opéra that's his real goal. He'll go on to write 2 works specifically for Paris, and in addition, many of his later operas will get translated into French and produced there. He also will have to add a ballet to each of them. Verdi's major rival on the world's opera stages is his exact contemporary, the radical, indeed revolutionary German opera composer, Richard Wagner. Now, our tour group is very fortunate on our opera tour today to have tickets to the Paris opening night of Wagner's opera Tannhäuser. It's the 13th of March, 1861. Now, Wagner, of course, had been in Paris before in the 1840s, living very much hand to mouth, making money by copying scores, and excuse me, spending his time trying to convince, totally unsuccessfully, the Opéra to produce one of his operas, or at least commission him to write a new one. He was thoroughly insulted, would be a tame word, when a libretto he wrote was handed over to another composer. But its failure, as Dietzsch's Le Vaisseau Fantôme, will become Wagner's much more successful Flying Dutchman in just a few years. Now we know that Wagner came back to Paris earlier last year, in 1860, to conduct some concerts of his work. I think he felt he had to prepare the audience for his operatic debut with Tannhäuser. And we've heard that some of his listeners were indeed puzzled by the novelty of what they heard. This is a very different kind of music for Paris. Others, however, were ecstatic, including the poet Charles Baudelaire, who famously wrote to the composer himself that he'd experienced the greatest musical rapture of his life, jouissance. And on the opera's opening night, we in the audience witnessed something that would be quite shocking in a 21st century opera house. In 1861 in Paris, audience members' very loud shouting and blowing of dog whistles quickly interrupt and then completely drown out the music and the singers. Everything stops. Wagner withdraws the opera after 3 performances and leaves Paris. Cultural politics and musical taste combine to keep Paris Wagner free, but not for too long, because by the 1880s, all of Europe will be in the thrall of Wagnerian opera. As his 17-hour Ring of the Nibelung, performed in his specially built theater in Bayreuth, Germany, changes opera forever. That Italian emphasis that I talked about a minute ago on melody and voice, for Rossini's voce, 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 this is now going to be totally counterbalanced with the new Germanic emphasis on harmony and on the symphonic orchestra. Remember, Germany's the home of Beethoven and the birth of the symphony. So in contrast with that bel canto Italian sound you just heard, I hope you still have it in your ears, here's what the dramatic end of Wagner's very Germanic ring cycle sounds like.
And it's Wagner whose operas we're now going to follow across the Atlantic to New York City. New York was actually considered one of the 3 capitals of the German-speaking world in the late 19th century, the others being Vienna and Berlin. It was even an area, part of the city, known as Kleines Deutschland, Little Germany. And this is the site of a production of Tannhäuser as early as 1859. But it's now 1890, and we're going to attend the production of a Wagner opera in the newly built Metropolitan Opera House, where all of the operas are performed in German, and 60% of them are by Wagner. How did that happen? Well, opera in New York, from about 1854 on, took place in the Academy of Music, where having an opera box was considered to be the highest rung on the city's social ladder. But there were only 18 boxes. And this was considered very useful for the social elite, for it kept out the nouveau riche. So, in the late 1870s, when Mrs. William K. Vanderbilt, one of those newly rich, whose wealth was really astronomical, when she applied for a box at the Academy of Music, she was turned down. In a bit of pique and unwilling to accept this snub, she gathered some like-minded and like-moneyed individuals, bought land at 39th Street and Broadway, and built what would eventually built the Metropolitan Opera which eventually became known as the Old Met after Lincoln Center opened. The Metropolitan's first season is all Italian operas, and it's a financial disaster. And its backers, those new box holders of what is rather descriptively called the Diamond Circle, they're really only happy when they're making money, not losing it. So they fire the first impresario and hire one, Leopold Damrosch. And Damrosch is an interesting person. He's a friend of Liszt and Wagner, and he mounts programs all in German, no matter what the original language of the opera is, with German singers who happen to be a lot less expensive than those Italians.
So it's an economic motif in this.
This plan succeeds wildly, and much to the delight of the Diamond Circle members, their rival, the Academy of Music, proceeds to go bankrupt. It was Schadenfreude as well. But unfortunately, not all is so rosy. Leopold Damrosch dies suddenly in 1885. There's a hunt for his successor, and this turns up the real thing. One Anton Seidl, who's conducting tonight. Seidl has spent 6 years in Bayreuth, acting as Wagner's assistant, and this included helping with the production of the first Ring in 1876.
Now, Seidl is developing a substantial following here in New York. His productions are now considered the equal of any in the European houses, which is quite something. Cultural historians of the future will suggest that in these years, America's material comfort, because it was growing, is matched with a certain spiritual blandness. So people are searching for intense experiences to bring substance, interest to their lives. And it seems that Wagner provides precisely these intense experiences, especially for us, the bourgeois women in the group, limited as we are at this time in history by gentility and decorum. Known as the Gilded Age, this time in America marks women's new engagement in those voluntary associations that support cultural institutions and events. One of these associations is the Seidl Society. It was formed in 1889, and it's thanks to this society that we operateurs, or at least the women among us, are able to take an excursion today. It's now 1890, and we're going, are you ready for this, to Brighton Beach on Coney Island. The Society is going to organize rail transportation for us, since it would otherwise be unavailable to women without escorts. We're going to be traveling, though, along with working women and some children. For the Society has been founded, we've read, for the purpose of securing to its members and to the public increased musical culture and of promoting musical interest among women particularly. It aims to reach all classes of women and children, and by its efforts in their behalf, to prove the potent influence of harmony over individual life and character. Isn't that wonderful? The ushers, distinguished by the silver S pins on their dresses, escort us to our seats in the large 3,000-seat music pavilion. Here, twice a day, we can hear serious modern music, primarily by Wagner, and conducted by Anton Seidl. This will continue actually until 1896, when what was called a monster wave, so I guess a tidal incursion, will flatten completely this pavilion. But we're visiting it. It's still up over there. And in 1898, Seidl himself will die at the young age of 48. But in 1890, the time of our visit, Wagner is the second most programmed composer in orchestral concerts, right after Beethoven. In opera circles, he continues to be popular, but those all-German seasons at the Met do end, and eventually operas are performed there in their original languages. Now, I have to open a quick parenthesis out of Canadian pride. The Met would not introduce what are called Met titles, these helpful translations on the back of the seats, until 1995. And that is some 12 years after surtitles were invented here in Toronto by the Canadian Opera Company. Sorry, I had to get that.
But the 1890s marked the start of something else in musical and operatic terms, and that's the birth of modernism. The first modernist opera to reach New York is Richard Strauss's Salon in 1907. This is the opera adapted from Oscar Wilde's decadent tale of the 16-year-old princess who asks for the head of John the Baptist as her reward for performing the famous Dance of the Seven Veils. Now, on our tour, As music lovers, we have tickets for the opera's premiere at the Met. And our seats are in the orchestra where true music lovers sit. The wealthier are still enjoying their boxes. But we're the ones who stay when others leave in disgust. At the moment, when Olive Fremstad, as Salome, sings her shocking love song to the severed head of John the Baptist, followed by what is being called the most sickening chord in all of opera. Let's have a listen. It seems the reviewers also stayed because the next day they talk of experiencing a strange horror. And one of them complains about the moral stench exhaled by the decadent and pestiferous work, calling it an exudation from the diseased and polluted will and imagination of the authors. The Met's stockholders at a special meeting forbid for further performances. And here's the front of Harper's showing Salome discharged without honor from the Metropolitan Opera. We, however, are lucky to have been there for what will go down in history as Fremstad's mesmerizing performance.
But if we really want to understand opera in the 20th century, we need to cross the Atlantic again and briefly visit Vienna, the birthplace of musical modernism. Here, Strauss's dissonant music that you just heard and those decadent stories are much less radical than what Arnold Schoenberg is proposing. He and his students, Anton Webern and Alban Berg, are testing the very limits of musical tonality in their distinctly modernist search for progress and originality. To be honest, they write primarily for other composers. They believe that any work that does not extend their formal exploration is frankly worthless. In the process, they leave a lot of us, their audience, behind, I'm afraid. Here's what modern music of this sort sounds like in Webern's hands. And, like Weber and Schoenberg, doesn't really care if we, the audience, are with him or not. In his words, if it's art, it's not for all. If it's for all, it's not art. In other words, the customer is always wrong. As a strategy to alienate audiences, modernism is very successful in two ways. It creates, and this is one very positive thing, perhaps the greatest opera about alienation ever written. And that's Alban Berg's incredibly powerful Wozzeck. But modernism also drives some audiences away from modern opera, making us turn to the past, to the repertory of past hits that for the last 100 years has been playing in the opera houses of the world. This is always jokingly referred to as the ABCs of opera, the Aidas, Bohemes, and Carmens, that audiences continue to love and demand. It's not that new operas do not continue to be composed in the 20th century, they do, but it's a century whose musical history is one of a splintering of musical styles and a series of very acrimonious debates. The most recent of these has been not about music, but about the power of the director in operatic productions. The radical rethinkings and updatings of canonical operas, which is called Eurotrash by some, flourishes on this side of the Atlantic too, and we suspect it may have pitted members of our own tour group one against the other at times. Musically, though, the dominance of one kind of modernism, Schoenberg's, in the conservatories and the universities has led to an academic denigration of a whole series of opera composers who chose to write in a very different, more accessible style. People like Giacomo Puccini, Richard Strauss, Benjamin Britten, and many others. We audiences, however, have certainly kept them in business and on stage. We've also welcomed reactions against the limitations of strict Schönbergian modernism, but it's with totally new ears, ears that have listened to a much wider range of musical styles than they would have earlier on this tour, that we listen today to the new tonality and the rhythmic innovations of composers like Philip Glass, John Adams, and others, who are collectively usually referred to as minimalists.
So now as we come to the end of our tour, we return to Toronto, where yet another operatic debate has been raging over just who is allowed to write an opera. The Canadian Opera Company has just commissioned for its main stage a popular music star, singer, and composer Rufus Wainwright to compose, along with the Governor General award-winning playwright Daniel McIver as librettist, an opera called Hadrian. The response shouldn't surprise us. Many Canadian composers and academics were really outraged. But Benjamin Stein has responded with a corrective, writing, Wainwright writes his lyrics as well as music in 2 different languages. How many composers do that? Wainwright also accompanies himself while singing, and anyone who's heard him knows he can really play. Music schools are producing plenty of composers that can neither sing nor play, though I expect they're taught to orchestrate. The point is that professional training, ability, and experience takes many different forms, and opera can certainly accommodate a musician who does not come from a traditional classical background. And we, as now experienced opera audience members, know after our tour today through time and space, that opera is a constantly evolving, ever-changing, and always controversial art form. So perhaps we'll gather again for the premiere of Rufus Wainwright's opera Hadrian in 2018. Until then, thank you very much.